Hey, folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Butcher Shop, where the meat meets the water. On this episode, I'm joined by Fletcher Sams, the mad scientist behind the tweaker. Fletcher shares his passion for visual eats on swim bugs, and we take a deep dive into the tweaker, discussing the fishing problem that gave rise to it, the intricacies of its design, and how to fish it like its creator. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. To make sure you don't miss a single episode of The Butcher Shop, be sure to subscribe in the podcatcher of your choice. We're only distributing episodes on the Articulate Fly for a limited time. And if you like the podcast, please tell a friend and subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And finally, a shout out to our sponsor, Trout Routes. I've known the team at Trout Routes almost before there was a team at Trout Routes. We all know streams are getting crowded, and chances are you're not the only one at your local access point. Get away from the crowds and busy gravel lots by using Trout Routes Pro with over 350,000 access points, mapped across 50,000 trout streams, and much more. Trout Routes has all the data you need to help you find angling opportunities that others will overlook. Up your game and download the app today. Use code ARTFLY20, ARTFLY20, all one word, for 20% off of your Trout Routes Pro membership at maps.troutroutes.com. And a shout out to our friends at Schultz Outfitters. Schultz Outfitters is Southern Michigan's premier fly and tackle shop, and the guys at Schultz Outfitters are some of the fishiest dudes on the planet. Book a day on the water, swing by the shop, or check out one of their mini classes taught by some of the best anglers and tyers in the game today. Check them out at schultzoutfitters.com or give them a shout at 734-544-1761. Now, on to our interview. Well, Fletcher, welcome to the Butcher Shop.
Man, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. And before we take a deep dive into the tweaker, what have you been up to since bobbing?
Work and being a dad. I've snuck out some fishing trips here lately. It's been a good spring. But just hard to find those breaks with a, less than 1 year old in the house.
Yeah, it's that'll change your life for sure. I think we were commiserating before we started recording. I think if I end up going out of town this weekend, as I expect I'm going to have to, I'll have been out of town, I think 5 of the last 7 weekends.
It's just brutal. No thanks.
Yeah, I need to come up with an alternative plan. But as we kind of start drilling into the tweaker, where'd the name come from?
I always thought it would be kind of funny, like, Kelly has done all the, sex joke names and everything like that. Just to, if I were going to name a fly, it would be like some degenerate name. And so, started messing with that bug, and I just kept changing things with it and tweaking it, and just started calling it the tweaker. One of my buddies wanted me to call it the sex changer when I first started tying them, because kind of had a dungeon head on a game changer platform. And, thank God I didn't do that. But, it's like, keep going. And, it's going to be the tweaker, I guess, is where we landed on it.
Yeah, that's funny. So we're expecting flies like the meth head and some other variations in the future.
Yeah, I've got the quack head, and, I'm working on one that I'm calling the low life, and, hopefully just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah, with a little bit of a southern patina, right?
Yeah, right. But near dwells.
Yeah, and so, Fletcher, I think it's always interesting. I always like to ask the fly designers to kind of share the hole in their fly box that they were trying to fill when they designed the pattern. What was that hole when you started working on the tweaker?
When I first started working on the bug, it was, where I fish, I'm kind of a homebody fishing, because we've got kind of like a little paradise here in middle Georgia, and I've got access to all kinds of different species, trout, striper, 12 different species of bass, bowfin, gar, carp, buffalo, just on and on and on. Right. And so, in particular, one of my favorite things to do is fish for red-eye bass. It's more of a solo thing, and it's small to mid-sized creeks. It's, if you are a brook trout fisherman. We were kind of the southern range for brook trout up in North Georgia. But it's much the same water, except for you're in middle Georgia, except for instead of the mountains, right? And these fish don't get like 12-inch ones, like a really good fish. It's like an 18-inch smallmouth, right? Like it's a decent sized fish, like 14-inch is a giant, right? But it's really beautiful fish. And, in these like really tight creeks with a lot of canopy, one of my favorite bugs to throw is like one of Blaine's bugs, bugger changer, right? And wanted something that I could have that was not going to have the same action as the bugger changer or do the same thing, but have a hookup presentation with a lighter weight bug that I could roll cast in that heavy cover. That was the whole, right? Is I thought that I could displace the weight with added buoyancy to the deer hair, add it to that platform, and just kind of see what happens, right? And that kind of led down like a whole lot of different changes with that. But the problem specifically that I started with was, wanted something with less weight that was offset with like buoyancy for keel, right? And would be hookup so that I could run it across some structure. Much like any hookup fly, right? But what I started noticing when I started fishing it, it's kind of my first foray into deer here, seriously, and, wasn't very good at it and kind of had a lot of variation to the heads, and started originally tying kind of like a wider, dungeon kind of head. And then as I started messing with different head designs on the fly, just trying to get less buoyancy so that I could pierce the water and not stay in the film, started kind of giving it more of a real narrow profile just to add that keel. And when I started doing that, I really started noticing that the fly was like super weedless, and I could throw it into brush piles, throw it into rock gardens, and like get into cracks and just drag it out, right? And so then I started looking at it more as like, okay, so I'm not so much looking for something that's lighter weight. That's great. In that version of the fly, you can do all that you need to do, and you can roll cast it with a like 5 or 6 weight, 20 feet, right? Which is what you need to be able to do. But chasing that weedless action and trying to get into different fish species and like bigger species that we target in different areas kind of led me down a path of like kind of chasing that real weedless nature of the bug. And where we ended up, it's got a whole lot of different action to it and a lot of different triggers. But the hole that I was originally trying to fill was something that was lighter weight, but that would ride hook up in a creek.
Got it. And so you mentioned Blaine's Booker changer. Kind of any other tires influenced the design as you kind of evolved it?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, it was, starting out, it was, I knew that I needed a lead head in order to get some weight into it. And so it started out literally with just a dungeon head on it. And, I would say that, having, Kelly's knowledge out there about hair density and everything like that really helped out. And then I started, kind of looking at all kinds of these like hair wizards that are like packing these big crazy bugs like Cohen, like all those other guys that are just, Andreas Anderson, all those dudes are just kind of, wizards, and they're really packing those bugs tight, and can do all this crazy stuff with hair, and really started to kind of mess with hair on its own, and then kind of came back to that bug and started working on it and making it more of its own thing. But I would say that, initially those two are like the initial inspiration for that bug.
Got it. And so we kind of talked about the fishing problem, but you didn't mention bite triggers. So what kind of, bite trigger did you want to incorporate into the fly?
So, I knew that I wanted it to suspend. I did not want to have the jigging action, which, a bugger changer does have a big jigging action. And it's one of my favorite flies of all time. But I wanted something that would just get into that middle column, especially when I'm going into the weedless nature of it. We started kind of looking at it as like, this is giving us an ability to put a fly that's going to animate and stall into a hole that doesn't see tackle. And we started searching out water that would be difficult to put a non-weedless lure or fly into. And started seeing a lot of bites coming out of there, but the size that we were at where was like too small, right? The hook gauge was too light and they were straightening out on big fish in these holes. And so we started upsizing the hooks on them. And when we started upsizing the hooks, not just the size of the hook, but the gauge of the hook, the hook would kind of flop over to the side, like the head would keel, right? Like the buoyancy of the deer hair and the weight of the lead eyes, it's perfect. It'd sit there and keel, but then the rest of the body would be kind of sideways in a goofy looking way, not a fishy looking way. Kind of like it was like twisted, like a ribbon, and so we started adding a little bit of keel weight, just trying to get just enough where we could get the hook to ride point up on a stall. And when we started adding that into the larger gauge hook flies and larger flies, the trigger that we were seeing, the head will kind of wobble and pick a side. It's kind of random. It's not like walk the dog. It'll show side profile, but when it does show side profile, the belly, the weight on that belly will kick in front of the head and kind of push upward and flash the belly towards the angler, right? So what we were seeing is if we're putting it into these isolated holes on the bank they're surrounded by structure, you can't drag a lure out of them, can't, put a fly in it and just twitch it in the hole. You've got to be able to run over a couple of logs that are running parallel to the water and then undercut rock. And it's all in one big kind of pool that's isolated up against the bank, right? Just envision that. And so what we were seeing is on the flies that we were keel weighting the hook on these bigger hooks, the fish that would be chasing it, they would start tracking it. And if they didn't, just suicide straight into it and just slam the thing like as a reaction bite, they'd be tracking it. And when they saw that belly flip, even though the color, the white of the belly is flipping towards me and the fish is chasing it from the bank towards me, it's still seeing that fish kind of go sideways and show profile. But the thing that we were also seeing is that the fish that were between me and the fly were seeing the flash and coming straight out from the boat towards the fly. And so that belly flip into the kind of T-bone profile is showing a lot of triggers. And then you just, let the thing sit and hover, and it's not gonna dip. It's just gonna stay there. And if you want to give it a couple of taps, it'll do the same thing every time you give it a tiny tap or a big tap. So you can set it in one little location and make it struggle in that hole. Even if there's a bunch of current in it, you can just kind of give tiny mends upstream. And every time you give it a mend, even if it's a tiny mend, that thing's going to animate like crazy. Every time that there's slack in the line, it's just going to show that side profile.
Interesting. So it's almost like it's like that Rapala roll, right?
Yeah, it's like the Rapala roll, and like I know that we're talking about the tweaker, but like that quackhead that I tie, it's got a, kind of a solid mallard wing, and it's got that same kind of action. And, it's once you see kind of the reactions from fish following it from where you cast it and tracking in from where you are to it, because they're seeing the belly flash, it's a, it, it's a really good action if you can incorporate the side profile as well as that, kind of belly roll flip.
Yeah, very, very neat. And so, if you kind of walk us through the bug, if we take the tweaker and we kind of, we'll, I guess, work through it and then kind of the way you tie it. So if we go from the back to the front, can you kind of walk us through the pattern? And also, I think it'd be really interesting to hear any patterns as you were kind of evolving the tweaker that you're like, they just don't work and they didn't make the final cut.
Yeah. So, we've got different sizes, but I'd say, the size that we use the most, kind of the standard, is what we call the XL. And you've got, 2 10 millimeter shanks in the back, and then 2 15 after that. And that's connecting to like a size 2, either XO 774 or a SA 274, the 2 Airx hooks that are like kind of gammarous short shank hooks, with like a deep stinger bend to them. And then it's got a shank as the head. If you start in the back, it's kind of a feather game changer based bug. And if you start in the back, like if you've heard Schultz and Blaine or, any of those guys kind of talk about the different tails, they call it a knife tail. So it's just 2 rooster tails, or 4 rooster tails sitting together like praying hands, like collapsed together like a knife blade. And then you progressively move the taper up, those 4 shanks. And when you get to the hook, on the shank connection to the hook, you're attaching a tungsten drop bead onto the bottom of the shank connection. And that allows you to like move the center of gravity like way below where the actual shank of the hook is without using a ton of weight. You're able to stabilize that hook vertically, right? So using less weight to get it keeled, right, by using that kind of bead. And because I'm using the shank attachment on that hook, I'm already having a shank there, so there's already a loop for me to put that bead on. And so I just put it on the loop and tie it there, move forward, put lead eyes, and then a hair head on top of that. And the hair head is tied basically like you're cutting the head where the widest it will get is as wide as the eyes that you're using. And we use medium lead eyes. So we're trying to keep it somewhat light and weight balanced. It is a little weight unbalanced. It is a little heavy, but it's not like collapsing the loop heavy, but it'll suspend. It does not have enough weight to kind of jig. And the important parts of the bug and what really makes it different is the hook and the head and the weighting system. And what that stinger bend short shank hook allows you to do, if you keel it slightly with the weight, is that weight will move the hook point, which is already down and pointed down because of the stinger bend, put that hook point while it's riding level through the water just at the top of the deer hair head, right? And so when it's passing through a bush or bumping through rocks and logs and stuff like that, if you're going slow and not trying to, I'm going to hit the structure and, rip it out, right? Like if you're going slow, it'll just slither through that stuff and you'll see big fish just come and slam it into dry structure. It's pretty nuts. But the way that the head is not slightly, is more buoyant than the body, especially that weighted hook, it just kind of rides above the hook point until a fish bites it, and then it finds the hook point and you're off to the races. So it's that deer hair is doing two functions. It's acting like a keel guard, and it's also, or like a weed guard, and it's also acting like a keel, right? So, the reason I'm making them so, and if you look at them, they're like a ton of hair above the shank and not pretty much anything below the eyes. And that's so that I can get that density of the deer hair to where the thing will keel without putting a ton of weight into the bug, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And if I remember correctly, too, you like to tie your tail since you're doing a knife tail. You actually prefer to not use a tail shank, but to use a normal 10 millimeter because you like the support, right?
Yeah. So, like if you're trying to tie anything just on like a straight round shank, it's especially something that is also round, like the stem of a feather, it's just going to have the propensity to roll, right? And so if you're using a loop and a loop shank, you're able to kind of climb your thread up the loop and create like this flat wall for the feather to kind of rest against. And even if you don't tie it in perfect, it's not going to roll because it's got like both sides of that shank kind of holding it in place. So that I like that tail too, because if you're going to get a fly that's going to show a lot of profile, or that's the action that you're trying to get, is that T-bone kind of profile. I feel like that's one of the slipperiest tails that you can put on one of these swim bugs, is like that bladed knife tail, like, Schulte puts on his swinging D. It's like you don't want any resistance in that tail. You want that thing to just slip through the water.
Got it. And I know we kind of walk through the proportions for the XL version, but I know you tie it smaller for trout and other things. Are there, other kind of, proportions for kind of different flavors of the tweaker you can share with folks?
Yeah, so like the size that we're using for red eye bass, it's just uh three 10 millimeter shanks and then a tail shank. We're putting a marabou tail on it. Then for the support on those bugs, and I should probably do a video on it, but for any of these little bugs, like feather changer based bugs, I find that like the amount of support that you're needing, going back, like a feather changer's built, using brush for support and then the feather for the veil. And the feather's more or less what gives it the swim and the body that you see, right? And the support, in my mind, is just there for support, right? So just there to hold that shape and give it that form. And um, I find that I can pretty much create the shape that I need with like maximum 3 wraps of material. Um, and so I don't put a lot of support on the bugs, but on those little bugs, for folks that are wanting to kind of cheap it out, if you think about using 10 millimeter shanks, you don't have like a lot of space on those shanks, right? Like, especially people starting out, they're like, oh my God, like I'm going to wrap a whole feather on, what is that, like 3 or 4 millimeters worth of length that's flat, right? From where the loop goes down to the actual flat part of the shank. Am I making sense there?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So where that transition is forward, it's like not 10 millimeters. The whole thing is 10 millimeters. So you got like a very small space. But if you use like like half-inch brush or even a quarter-inch brush, and you start your brush like progressively working up the shank. So on the first shank, you do 1 wrap right there at that junction where it goes flat. And then the next shank up, you do 1 wrap, like, so on that closed loop on a shank, if you put a little super glue on it, you can climb your thread back up the loop, right? And so give yourself a little bit more room. You don't want to put a feather there, but if you start your taper further up the loop, you're effectively making your material longer, right? So you're making that section wider, but you're also giving it more density by putting 2 wraps there. So what I'll do is I'll start the brush progressively higher up on the loop as I go forward without changing the brush size. And I'll just put up to 3 wraps going up the shanks. And it's like a built-in taper system where you can make a quarter inch brush up to a half-inch brush at the top shank. And you can, increase the density by putting extra wraps by starting at the top and then terminating right there where it gets the flat space on every shank. So that's kind of a different way of building taper on some of these smaller bugs that I haven't seen other people do, but that's how I build the taper on it. And then for those bugs, I would say like a size 6 NS172, which is a lighter wire gauge, Airex hook, and then a 15 millimeter instead of a 20 millimeter head, and small lead eyes. And that thing is crazy light. It's totally weight balanced. Doesn't have the belly flip, but does have that kind of knuckleball, like it's searching here and there, but you can tie those down. They're about like 3 inches long ish. And so you can get, the XL is 5 inches. That's like 3.5, depending on how long you make the tail. And then, we've been doing striper versions too, where we're, instead of using those kind of Gamera's hooks, we've moved to like, we'll take a 28 millimeter big game shank and put that in the front. And that's because we want double closed in loop shanks, because that's super important for big fish. Because I know that people don't want to believe this, but like you can straighten the eyelet on these shanks pretty easy if you're into a big fish, right? So you don't want to put weight on any shank that's got that open eyelet on it. So, we're moving to big game shanks in the front with closed loops, and we're doing like 8/0 blue water hooks on them, and we're just like floating them down crazy wave trains with tons of structure, and they're just getting demolished. It's super cool. So, the world's your oyster, but the idea of that weighted keeled stinger bend hook that's got a short shank and then a head with deer hair that's high as the actual barb of the hook, that's kind of the recipe. So you can kind of play around with different stuff. And then we've got kind of a commercial version that we, it's like a guide fly version of it with like a rabbit tail that will be in the Umpqua catalog this year. So super stoked about other people getting to fish this thing.
Yeah, very, very cool. And before we kind of move away from proportions, people are going to want to know, like, we said tungsten teardrop beads, but kind of, bead size to pattern to kind of help them not have to kind of tie flies that are improperly keeled, right?
Yeah, so you don't want to put too much weight on them. If you are adding the weight on with that shank system, the shank wire is going to be kind of limiting on you going too light. In other words, like if you're using like something smaller than like a 4 millimeter bead, it may or may not slip over the shank wire and actually fit. So we usually use like 4 millimeter, 4.6 millimeter beads. Umpqua makes them, and I believe a couple other companies maybe make these kind of tungsten drop beads, where instead of the hole for the bead being in the center, the bead's kind of shaped like a teardrop, and it's in the top of the teardrop.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know the comp guys like fishing those teardrop beads too.
Yeah, I mean, it's as far as getting something that's going to actually keel the hook the way that you want it to and not roll around in a bunch of current, it's pretty slick.
Yeah, pretty neat. And so, we ought to kind of dive into a little bit more detail on the deer hair head. And, what do you look for? I know everybody's different about what they want in their deer hair, but what are you looking for when you tie the tweaker?
So I prefer belly hair over body hair, just in general. I think that it's a more durable fiber on the belly hair, but it's also, you're going to generally find larger diameter fibers on the belly hair. That's not always 100% true, but like if you can't get to the shop and feel it in the bag, like that's a good chance you're going to get some better suited hair if you're sticking with belly. But what I'm looking for in hair is like, I want the largest diameter fiber as I can that's long enough for the bug. And if you are looking at the collar of the bug, you're just wanting to match that last hen collar in size. And so, you kind of have a gauge as far as how long you want it. It's not crazy long. But longer hair is better. But for me, it's 100% about the diameter of the hair. And that is because I like to really kind of be able to fine tune the density of the hair, because there's a couple of, games that you're playing with this platform. One is the shank length on the hook. So like a longer shanked hook is going to be a higher percentage of hookups, right? And then the density of the deer hair is another game that you're playing, right? Which is like gonna affect a whole lot of stuff, but then also the height of the deer hair and the length of the head are also games that you're playing, because the gap between the hook point and the deer hair head is what you got to work with to hook the fish, right? So if it's a super visual game, like you're going to see them eat this fish. It's impossible for you to like get the fly deep enough in the water that you're not going to see it. It's going to be brutal. That's why we fish it, because the eats are just absolutely insane. But with the density, you can get it tight enough where it's going to stay in the surface film, which isn't a bad thing. Or you can tie it a little bit looser and get it down maybe like 6, 7, 8 inches and like kind of into that kind of part of the water column, which isn't much difference, but sometimes it can make a difference. Like we fish a lot of rock structure where the opening to the structure, the window that the fish can kind of see the fly, you do need to get it down, or you need to get it down below the log where the fish can see it on the underside of the log. And so if I've got a thicker fiber on the deer hair, it's easier for me to, like, when I pull the bundle, say, okay, it's like not big enough, small enough. And then also the other fibers, when you're shaving the head and doing the final shave down, it'll give you more of a smooth surface, even if you're going like a lighter density where it's not anywhere close to packed. You can, squish the head all the way down to the shank, but it's a super uniform cut. And that's usually like because of the diameter of the deer hair will allow you to get that cleaner cut. So that's really the hair qualities that I'm looking for, is like as thick as I can get it, and then length second is what I'm looking for. And then if you look at my flies, like color is really important to me. I've gotten to the point now where like there's this dude named Colin Nash, and like he'll just dye up material the colors that I want. so I don't have to, deal with the color thing anymore. But like color would be a third.
Got it. And if we kind of talk about the XL, to help people with proportions, and I don't know, I guess people lots of times like to talk about pencils. Can you kind of talk about the amount of deer hair for the collar and kind of the top and the bottom of the head?
Yeah. So, I hate using the pencils because it's like a squishy material. Like, that's why it pops, right? So it's, how tight are you holding the pencil? But to give you an analogy that I think is like more useful than the pencil thing, it's like ratios, right? So if you were to say the pencil analogy, which is close to a pencil in my mind, it's a pencil for the collar, a pencil for the top of the head stack, half a pencil for the belly stack, and then 3/4 of a pencil for the front spin.
Got it. And, as we kind of talk about the head more, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but, I think it's super interesting kind of the interaction you have between the deer hair head and the eyes and the weight to keel the fly, right? Just kind of from a design perspective. Can you talk about that a little bit more and like, how you matched, figured out matching the bead to the eyes to the head?
Yeah. So, we started out, in the Umpqua bugs like this, we were tying dumbbells to like extra small dumbbells to the rear hook. And that is about the same weight as these tungsten jigs. But what we found is that the tungsten, because it hangs so much lower, it just also kind of acts as like, it stabilizes more, almost like a gyroscope. I mean, it's not the same principle, but it's because it hangs lower, you're able to kind of get more of that belly flip to it. So, it still has that profile. It still has that belly flip if you're using the dumbbells, but by hanging the weight like super, super low, by attaching it to the bottom of the shank wire, it really exaggerates where it's like that belly flip it's basically like parallel to the water surface. I mean, it's a big wobble. And so, arriving at that size, it's basically, a 4 millimeter bead is like the smallest thing that you can slip over that shank wire. And that's kind of, you might be able to go lighter if you were to do it belly scratcher style and like tie it in with articulation wire. But to go off on a little rant, shank connections are the most durable. I, don't catch saltwater fish. I don't do a lot of saltwater fishing, but I catch a lot of big freshwater fish and break a lot of flies. I break a lot of shank connections. But, if you're going to build like these bugs that take an hour to build, I don't want them to break. And so, using that shank connection wire is kind of a must for me if you're going to, connect a changer type of tail to a body. Like, you need that connection to be solid and not be the weak point in the fly, especially if you're going to put weight on it, which this doesn't put weight on it, but it's just kind of a forceful habit.
Interesting. So it's really fascinating. So really what you're doing with that teardrop bead is you're putting more mass kind of in the center line of the hook, right?
Like way below. So, it's like if you've seen somebody use like a shank connection to add a game changer body to a front hook, and they kind of tie in, like in Blaine's book, there's a really good illustration where he's like kind of opens up the loop at the shank, ties down the wire over the bend of the hook, and then slides the body on the open part of the shank, and then closes the shank and ties it all in. Right before, you put your body on it, and then you put your bead on it, tie it closed at the flat part, and then bring your thread back over the bead, tie the bead down, and then your bead's just kind of hanging on that shank wire. And because it's a hookup design, that bead's hanging probably like the bead probably starts 3 millimeters below the hook shank. And so the weight of the thing is probably like 6 millimeters below the hook shank. So it just like not a whole lot of weight, and it just really like stabilizes that hook on the paws, right? So it'll maintain it. It has its own momentum. It's heavy enough to have its own momentum to kind of kick that belly out in front of the head when you pop it, and it'll get that belly roll flash up, and then when it's stable, it'll stabilize straight back into that T-bone. And so I think having the bead lower exaggerates the amount of belly flip, like how much it flips vertical.
Yeah, I guess also too, like I'm just thinking like as opposed to having the weight on the eyes being kind of out on the outside away from the shank, right? It's in closer, right?
Oh yeah.
And so that helps the tip over as well, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I understand what you're saying. Yes, because you don't have the mass on the other side of the shank, like kind of fighting it. It's like everything's like right there in line with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It's like tipping something over, right?
yes, correct. It's like unbalanced until it immediately kind of corrects itself.
Yeah. Super neat. And it's funny too, because preparing for the interview, I watched your scoff, video from the fish hog. And,
Oh yeah, the all hour and a half of it.
dude, I watched the whole thing. And I'll drop a link to it in the show notes. But one of the things that really struck me, and we were talking about this before we started recording, is, you've got, I mean, there's just a ton of insanely useful tying tricks that kind of show that you kind of see the world in a different way. And, in terms of like, how you blend and palmer the hackle, how you are able to kind of build kind of thread dams over sharp spots on shanks, how you like to deal with the tag of like brushes, and also to your dislike of UV resin. But I think the curious thing about it was, it's a very different way of seeing the world and making these things better. And I was kind of curious about kind of your process for kind of like refining and finding these tricks and lifesavers at the vise.
Yeah, it's when I started kind of getting into predator tying, it was like YouTube videos and stuff like that. Like Fish Hawk is pretty good way away from me, even though it is like the closest shop to me. It was hard to get up there and like really kind of dig into some of these designs. And, back then there was hardly anything on this. I think, like Schultze eventually did some videos on some feather changers stuff. And, that was eye opening. And then you started, tinkering with this stuff based on the knowledge that was out there. It seemed kind of like everyone had a little bit of a different approach to the same kind of bug. And so I started talking with a lot of local anglers, local tires, and, have a close group of friends. You've met them before. They come up to bobbing with me. Travis Smith, Adam Smith, Seth Clark, and we all tie and we all kind of get into the problem solving aspect of fishing, and we all are just nuts about this shoal bass that's native to Georgia. And so a lot of the tires around here also fish for that. And, it's kind of a set of water that doesn't really kind of compute with folks like from the Midwest or really from anywhere. Is like kind of the fall line habitat that we have in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, where, our rivers can get, go from like 60 yards wide to like 600 yards wide into just endless pocket water that drops in a couple hundred feet in elevation over, 20 miles. And so it's kind of this just real gnarly warm water crazy stuff. And a lot of these flies that were being built and used in all these other fisheries, like just couldn't deliver the fly into some of the holding areas that these fish are in. And so we just started tinkering with stuff. And in the tinkering with stuff, like we just started really getting into all kinds of different flies, not just, these swim flies, real complicated swim flies, but other things. And there's just a lot of different techniques that I think and philosophies that you can bring into the swim fly kind of world. And that's, I'm taking little bits and pieces here and there, and like I'm always picking up something new, but a lot of it's just trial and error because we're kind of isolated down here in middle Georgia without a fly shop or any kind of, fly tying mentors outside of Atlanta, so it's hard for us to get up there sometimes. And so a lot of times it's just kind of figuring it out amongst ourselves. And doing that, I started seeing a lot more videos of like other people doing it. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't do it that way. And so when, Southern Culture on the Fly asked me to do the video, I was like, well, I'll just kind of talk through the way I do it because I do it a little different. And thinking that I'd have like a 15-minute video, but then Lee Gardner, who used to work with the Fish Hawk, now is kind of like on his own doing promotion stuff. But he filmed it and he was like, I don't want to take any of this stuff out. So it's an hour and a half. Sorry. Gave it to Hank. And so, that's kind of how all those tips and tricks got into there, is because he hadn't seen any of that stuff either. And so, it's like, I didn't know how different it was until, I kind of started seeing how everybody else was doing it, because everybody else kind of started posting videos on how they were building these things.
Yeah, and it seemed too that a lot of it was driven by the fact that I guess you as you explained in that video, shoal bass have really sharp teeth, and so there was a really big focus on durability.
Yeah, super big focus on durability. And then like outside of like the shoal bass, tearing up flies, like we do a lot of fishing for bowfin, striper, and they're tearing up gar, and they all tear up flies in different ways, right? And so, you asked about the resin thing. I think the first time that I really was like, I don't know about this whole resin shit, is Mustache at Fish Hawk. I don't know if you know or have met the Mustache, but you need to. He's kind of like local legend that in the Southeast, really, but has no social media presence or anything like that. But he was going to Bolivia and doing some goldenrado stuff and asked me to tie up some bugs, and tied him up some feather changers, and knew that they were going to have like some pretty gnarly bite strength and going to tear up flies. And I just wanted to see how durable a fly I could make, and a feather changer. And, did a couple of things different. Like every feather that I wrapped on, I switch threads, wrapped GSP all the way back over the stems, where it's like, you basically like palmer the hen forward, and then you wrap back over them, where you like kind of cut them in half in size. And then I would shellac that with resin, put brush in front of that, and then, kind of reverse order of what Blaine's doing, where the feathers are kind of stacked in between brushes. It looks almost the same, but no exposed feather stems, no anything, and like just coated in resin, the whole thing. And yeah, like 2 fish were just popping through the resin core, and like there's not a speck of resin on it, all chipped off and flaked off. And, I was like, I don't know about all this. And then started having other resin problems with like adhesion, like everyone does with like putting eyes on it and stuff. But after, I don't know, this is probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I started having crazy allergic reactions where like I'd break out in hives, my face would swell up, it's like I couldn't see out of my eyes, kind of thing, when I would tie flies. And I thought that it was like some sensitivity to dye or material, and thought that I was going to have to give it up, until someone had mentioned to me that it might be the UV resin cooking off, and started looking into that more, and it's absolutely that. Like I'm crazy allergic to it. When I got back from bobbing this year, I had a barely see out of my face. Didn't get me the year before, but it definitely got me this year. But even if you ask those dudes, like they'll tell you, like, yeah, there's 2 ingredients that everyone's sensitive to. And if you don't have ventilation, like at a tying show with a bunch, like 100 tires in a closed space with no ventilation, like everyone's allergic to it, and you're just going to get some sort of reaction. It might be mild, but it might not be mild. And so I just, it didn't seem like the most durable thing to me in the world. And also allergic as all get out to it. And I wasn't for years, but I became very allergic to it. And once I figured it out, it's like, all right, well, now I've got to get good with adhesives that don't have a lot of work time. And so Flex cement is my new best friend for anything thread, and E6000 is like the best adhesive ever known to man. It's bulletproof, and so I use that in place of most of my thicker resin work.
Got it. And before we kind of move on to discuss fishing the fly, I was kind of curious, what are three mistakes that you see that tires commonly make when they tie the tweaker?
Um, well, if they actually tie the tweaker, like if I give them the recipe, right? Like a lot of people will put a deer hair head on a game changer and be like, it's a tweaker. And I'm like, no, it's a, game changer deer hair head. But the folks that are actually trying to tie it, I would say the all the problems that I usually see are around the head, right? And going back to what you're trying to do, like you don't want a wide head. The widest you want to use the eyes as the gauge for how wide you want that head. No wider than the lead eyes. And you want a taller top of the head, like a real tall top of the head. You want it to be level with the hook point. If you stretch out the bug, that hook point is the top of the hair. And the biggest mistake that I see is that, and on that hour and a half video, I talk about it. It's like you've got to shorten the length of the head. You do not want the head to go back towards the hook more than like a couple millimeters behind the lead eyes. And I cut a hard line in the head at that point because I don't want anything impeding the hookup more than it's already impeded with the head, if that makes sense, right? Like it's a weedless fly, so you're going to have a decrease in hookup percentage, but you're fishing it in places you can't fish other flies.
Got it. And so are there any tools, Fletcher, that you suggest to make someone's life easier when they tie the tweaker?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't have a half hitch tool for finishing off the head, like you're gonna be sucking. Even if it's just like a big pin that take the guts out of, like have something that you can do that half hitch tool move at the end. And then I don't know how many of them have tied a lot, but I hook myself kind of constantly when I tie these things. And so I take one of my kids' like little toy erasers and I break off a little piece of it and put it over the barb when I'm tying it so that I don't hook myself. And that's also a very, very helpful hint because you will hook yourself if you're messing with a deer here. It's just like you got to put your hands in certain places when you're laying the hair down. And when you're laying that collar down, the odds of you getting stuck are very high.
Yeah, and you actually did that in the video.
Yes, I did. Right after I said, watch out, don't do this. Yeah.
Don't be a dumbass, and boom, then
Yep.
it happened, right?
Yep, then it happened.
So, if we talk about like, fishing the tweaker, it's really, as we talked about, it's not a jig style, it's a swim style fly. And I was kind of curious, if you have kind of a bias in your personal fishing, do you generally like swim style over jig, or do you just kind of pick based on the situation?
No doubt jigging is a super effective way of fishing. So is using a bobber. It's not my go-to. I the thing that I really get out of fishing is like watching it happen. And swim flies, in my opinion, are like gonna be in the part of the water column that kind of lends itself to watching the whole thing play out. And so if I can get away with a swim fly, that's what I want to fish 100% of the time. Cause that's really what I'm there to do, is to watch the lion kill the gazelle. Like that's the kick out of it. Right. And so, it's cool to catch a big fish, but it's a whole lot cooler to see the big fish like chase down the thing that you just tied together with like fur and some nylon, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like smallmouth fishing and like watching like a white game changer just disappear.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, sure, it's like if you're not into it for the visual thing, man, like hang something on a bobber. I bet you'll catch more fish.
Yeah. And so, so where do you generally like to kind of fish the tweaker in the water column?
So, like I was talking about earlier, like it's a structure bug, and when I say structure bug, like people are like, oh yeah, like it's like you can like throw it in like over a log and like drag it over the log and it'll be okay. But it's like we are throwing this thing in like the nastiest little thing that we think can hold a big fish that's just kind of chilling out. And so, we use this to like climb up and over structure that's out of the water, right? So we're throwing it onto the bank, dragging it into the water, that kind of thing. And so I think that like as far as the water column goes, and like I was talking about playing with the hair density where you can get them to sink a little bit, like we don't need these things to sink more than 6 to 8 inches at the most. So it's right up there at the top of the water column.
Got it. And so I guess that probably means you're probably generally fishing it on a floater. What's the rest of your tackle setup?
Yeah, so 100% on a floater. You can put it, of course, there's no rules. You can put it on whatever you want to, but like if you're going to fish it the way that we fish it, like in that kind of structure, you're gonna tear up your fly line if you're using a sinking fly line with a short leader and putting it in there, right? Like, so what we tend to do is like a very thick, like we'll typically use like 8 weights when we're fishing. Sometimes we'll go lighter, but ideally an 8 weight, and use a floating line. And probably like the shortest leader that we'll use is 9 feet. Most of these holes are going to be kind of that like 15 feet wide at the most kind of size. Like they're not big holes that we're trying to find that are like just cluttered up with logs and rocks and current and all this stuff. Like they're not big places. And so um they are big enough where we don't want the fly line dragging across the stuff that we want the fly to drag across. So we'll typically use like a 12-foot leader, right? And the lightest tippet that we'll use is 20 pounds, and it's all fluoro. And one that helps it kind of get into the, below the film, but it's also just for abrasion resistance. And like you're going to have to retie, but like we're using 50-pound butts and tapering down to 20, which is like overkill for an 8 weight. But we just want that abrasion resistance on all that structure that we're going to drag over.
Got it. And so if we kind of back up a little bit, in terms of the rod, are you looking for something that's pretty stiff? So like I know Schultz and those guys like those Loomis rods, or do you want a little bit more give in the tip? What's your favorite kind of rod action?
No, that's my favorite kind of rod action. Like that Schulte rod, man. I fucking love that thing. Sorry. That rod's amazing. But it's all because of that super stiff tip. And, you can impart a ton of action on swim flies with that kind of action. You can do it all day with that grip too. I mean, that rod just ticks all the boxes. Now, if Loomis would get their act right and make a 10 weight, I would not buy any other rod. But that's neither here nor there. I don't think that's in the cards. But you want a stiffer tip. This rod, I mean, this fly, you don't need a whole lot of pop and rod movements to give it action. Like you can do jerk strip pops. It will give a heavy belly roll, but so will like a tiny little strip. As long as you're giving it a little bit of slack where it can go and show profile, it'll do that belly roll on like a 2-inch strip as long as you pop it and give it slack. So, it's like we'll do a lot of different presentations in there. One of our favorite presentations is we'll try to throw onto the bank or onto a dry rock and like have the fly land there. That gives the line the chance to like hit, not spook the fish. And then we'll start just literally like kind of twitching the rod tip, just kind of shaking it back and forth. And that'll kind of drag drag the fly into the water and just kind of like shimmy it every once in a while and then give it a couple of pops, and like they just can't handle it. So there's a lot of different action that you can put into this thing, but that fly will move a whole lot with minimal effort. And so it's less about like exactly what kind of action you're putting into it. The big thing is like you want to make sure that when that fly is eaten, you want to see it's not when it goes in the fish's mouth, it's when that fish's mouth closes that you want to actually set the hook. And what I find is if you're doing like big, crazy stuff, like crazy rod tip movements down, and you create that big shock, like slack wave in those kind of smaller pockets, you just have so much slack in there that like it's hard to get that hook set right. And so for me, it's like, yes, it will put the action into the fly, but in the spaces that we're doing this, like the fly is going to have the same action with smaller movements. And so I want to keep that fly in that hole for as long as I can, looking dead and dying.
Yeah.
And so, for me, it's like smaller movements, not big jerk strips.
Yeah. And so are you, when you do those small strips, I would imagine you're in line. Are you actually, pushing the tip back to the fly to create a little bit more slack?
No, it's kind of like splitting your hands, meeting your hands in the middle in front of you with the rod pointed like kind of at the fly, and just kind of splitting your hands apart and then bringing them back together. If that makes sense.
Yeah, got it. And then also too, we didn't talk about the line. So you've got a floater, but what kind of taper do you like on that?
I, a long time ago when scientific anglers came out with those Titan lines, it's like, that's just what I fish, just because it's consistent and they have all the different line types with the exact same weight heads. And that's what I fish across all my flies on all my reels, is like that specific line.
Yeah, particularly if you're roll casting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we kind of start to wrap up this evening, are there folks, tying variations or evolutions of the tweaker that you find particularly interesting?
Yeah, like Fred Schroeder is probably the dude that's tied the most to these things. And he's tying a version that he's calling the trout tweaker. It's not weedless, but he put a tail hook into it, and he's been catching a ton of trout. But he fishes the XL version a bunch for like lake trout and big browns, and like he does really well on the trout. I don't do a lot of trout fishing, but apparently he's done incredibly well with the standard versions and that kind of tail hook version. I don't know if it's inspired, but it's not a weedless fly, so it's just kind of a totally different thing. But it's still a cool bug. It seems to be catching a lot of fish.
Yeah, very neat. And also, too, tell us a little bit more. So, Umpqua picked up your flies, which is super cool, right?
Yeah, thanks.
And so, tell us a little bit about kind of, when folks are going to see them in the market and variations and all that kind of good stuff.
So it's, I talked to the dudes, Matt Winkler at Umpqua yesterday, and they're going to be in this year's catalog. So I guess like a month-ish from now, they should be coming out. I know Schultze should have a bunch of them on hand right now, like a few dozen, in 3 different colors. The Umpqua bugs are smaller. They're kind of closer in size to the original bug. So they're like 3.5 inches, I want to say. They, instead of a game changer body, they've got a rabbit strip as a tail, but everything, from the hook forward is kind of identical to the other bugs. And instead of the tungsten bead, we're using, the lead eyes in the rear. But that bug, we also went with a slightly longer hook shank. The Umpqua, it's called a XS 425. And so, for a commercial fly, we wanted something that was going to be on the more forgiving end of the hookup ratio versus weedless aspect of it. So still very weedless. However, it's going to have a slightly better hookup ratio than like the shorter shank hooks have.
Got it. Anything else you want to share with our listeners before we go tonight?
No, I think that's it. If you want to, get into tying this and you have any questions, hit me up. If you don't want to tie them and you want like some of the full dress bugs that I did, like in the video that you're talking about, like Fred Schroeder will take your order and tie those up for you, so I don't have to. And they are like basic same recipe. He's tying the heads the right way and everything like that. So, he's tying them like I would tie them. And please hit him up instead of me if you want to just buy bugs.
Yeah, there you go. And so what's the best way for folks to get in touch and kind of follow your adventures at the Bison on the water?
Instagram, though I have not been posting much as of late. I've kind of got maybe the spot burning thing is not the best thing in the world, kind of syndrome right now.
Well, there you go. Well, I appreciate you spending some time with me, and it's always cool. I think you'll be probably the fourth guest on the Butcher Shop, so I appreciate you making the time.
That's wild, man. You're going to just trigger my imposter syndrome so much worse.
I think you're being too hard on yourself. I feel like I'm an imposter too, but it's kind of liberating for me because I'm like, guys, I didn't figure any of this stuff out. I'm just trying to organize the information for everybody. So, no risk of me copying anybody.
Yeah, well, I can't thank you enough for having me on, dude.
Well, I appreciate it. Well, listen, hopefully we'll get to spend some time on the water soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you're down here, just let me know.
Absolutely. Take care. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed the interview as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Don't forget to check out the links to all of this episode's sponsors in the show notes. Fish hard, folks.